point about the WHO and what you've just heard, it's really about priorities and the use of limited resources. WHO, like everybody else, does have limited resources. And it's currently focusing very much on non-communicable diseases, NCDs. Obsessively, I mean, there's a huge high-level UN meeting in New York in a few weeks' time about this, and they say 2/3 of deaths are from non-communicable diseases worldwide. This is a terrible epidemic. No, this is an improvement. We need to be very clear about that. In Britain, I think about 89% of deaths are from non-communicable diseases. In the healthiest countries, it's up to about 92%. Ideally, you would want it to be around about 100%. The WHO began, and for many years was, focused entirely on contagious diseases, and I think there is a very good reason for it staying in its lane and continuing to do so long as there are people dying in very large numbers from infectious diseases, tropical diseases, communicable diseases of all kinds. One, because they're actually relatively easy to cure or to prevent compared to lifestyle-related diseases. And two, because the relatively limited resources of the WHO should be directed at children, for example, dying from infectious disease, rather than old people dying from heart disease or cancer. Even assuming that WHO could actually prevent those diseases of old age anyway. I think that's basically the case for it sticking to its knitting, as it were, that there are still lots and lots of people dying from diseases like malaria. And no one's denying that there are health implications associated with drinking and smoking and obesity. Of course there are. But it would take a moral cretin to kind of conflate a 20-year-old dying from Ebola with an 80-year-old dying from respiratory disease. One of the big distinctions is these things are communicable. So there are neighborhood effects associated with infectious diseases, whereas lifestyle diseases are ultimately the result of private choices and don't have such effects. I was looking at the funding of the WHO quite recently, and as a British taxpayer, I was quite nonplussed with what I found. Obviously, most countries put something in. So we got South Africa, for example, put $600,000 in. China puts $10 million in, Italy puts $10 million in, Russia puts $9 million in, France puts $13 million in, that kind of figure. The UK puts $164 million in, second only to the USA. In fact, per capita, it seems to me the UK puts in more than any other country in the world, $164 million. The next down from that is Germany with $89 million, which has a larger population and a bigger economy. So we are paying over the odds, it seems to me, for whatever the WHO is doing. If you look down at specific projects, the FCTC, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, I think this is in a period of a year, I'm not quite sure from the figures, but the budget in this period was just over $5 million, of which the UK gave $3.7 million. In fact, there are only 3 countries gave anything at all. Australia, Panama gave a little bit, but we gave the lion's share. Now, the government did say a year or two ago that it demanded a bit more from the WHO in terms of it sticking to its priorities and being more transparent and the rest of it. Otherwise, it was threatening to at least reduce the amount of money that it was giving WHO. It's, as far as I can see, has done nothing in the way of reform. So it's not clear to me at all why the UK taxpayer is putting in so much more than other taxpayers around the world for the WHO's projects. And as you already heard, it is becoming more political. It is getting more into these areas, ultimately of lifestyle regulation, of interfering with the choice of adults in Western rich societies. It's increasingly pushed towards the priorities that rich Westerners have, and partly, to be fair, that is an issue of funding, because a lot of the funding does now come from people like Michael Bloomberg, whose own interests are lifestyle-related diseases in the rich world rather than communicable diseases in the developing world. But this kind of state funding of activism is widespread. It's endemic at the EU level. It's very common at the UK level. It extends way beyond this field of lifestyle regulation. I don't know if David might mention the various anti-science organisations who get EU funding. My interest is mainly around the kind of what I might call nanny state issues, so I'll focus on them. But there are various blobs where state funding is the norm. And this seems to me wrong. I mean, if you look at alcohol, for example, we have a sort of neo-temperance movement now in Europe and Britain. So you've got alcohol concern funded by the Welsh Assembly, alcohol focused Scotland, £500,000 from the Scots government, mainly funded by government. Scottish Health Action on Alcohol Problems, 100% funded by the Scottish government. Balance North East up in Darlington Way, lobbying for minimum pricing, advertising bans and so on, again 100% funded by local authorities. Over in Ireland you have Alcohol Action Ireland, created specifically to lobby for the alcohol bill in Ireland, specifically for that purpose, and is entirely funded by the Irish government, with a bit coming in from the lottery. The International Order of Good Templars, you may not have heard of them. It's a very old school 19th century temperance group. They get €6.5 million from the lottery and another £500,000 from governments. Another European temperance group called Active Sobriety, Friendship and Peace, 96% funded by taxpayers, mainly the European Commission. And the important thing about these kind of groups is they're not providing services as you might understand it. They're not providing health services. I have no problem with the government outsourcing certain health service. It's quite right that there are privately run hospices, for example, funded by the state. These people are not doing any of that. They're not even providing advice, let alone kind of cessation or rehab or any of the services you might associate with alcohol-related problems. They're just there to lobby. They're just there to lobby for minimum pricing, for advertising restrictions, for tighter licensing laws and so on. Much the same is true in the field of smoking and tobacco. Action on Smoking and Health has always been funded by the Department of Health, got £160,000 last year. The UK Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies, which is effectively an advocacy group, has had £45 million since it opened its doors about a decade ago. Fresh North East, actually share an office with Balance North East, the temperance group I just mentioned. Again, they get several £100,000 entirely funded by the state. A group called Breathe 2025. It's quite rather hard to tell where their funding comes from. Actually, ultimately, it comes from Public Health England. They were set up to lobby for plain packaging. Ash Scotland, 600,000 from the Scottish government. Ash Wales, 200,000 from the Welsh Assembly, plus a bit more from the European Union. And so it goes. More of them in Europe. The Smoke-Free Partnership, €400,000 from the taxpayer. European Network for Smoking and Tobacco Prevention, 314,000, and so on and so on. There's a little bit less of this in the field of obesity, but still quite a bit. The Department of Health recently gave £5 million to a new organisation called the Obesity Policy Research Unit, which is being led by one of the most vocal campaigners for sugar taxes, food reformulation, advertising bans, all the usual kind of stuff. Up in Scotland, we got Obesity Action Scotland, set up only a couple of years ago, again 100% funded by the Scottish government. At the EU level, you have the World Obesity Federation, €445,000. Up in the northwest, we have Food Active, an organisation called Give Up Loving Pop, campaigning for the sugar tax and banning the Coke truck from coming to Liverpool, and all these kind of important public services. And it goes on, and I'll probably bored you already just with an endless list of figures, but there are a lot of them. And as I say, it's not by any means confined to this area of lifestyle regulation. Now, the problems I see with this, I think there are several. As I say, none of them are providing anything by way of health provision or conventional services dealing with individuals who have problems with their weight, want to give up the smoking, want to cut down on alcohol use. They're just political lobby groups. The first problem, I think, is just simply wasteful. I mean, if the government wants to do these things, why bother funding activist groups to demand that you do it? Just do it. It's pretty obvious the Scottish government wants to bring in various prohibitions in the area of our food and diet. It's very obvious they always want to bring in minimum pricing. Do they really need to be giving organisations £500,000 a year to say, come on, Nicola Sturgeon, bring in minimum pricing? Just do it. Put it in the manifesto and do it. If, by contrast, the idea is to have a debate about this, then don't tip the scales. Let's have a debate. There are plenty, I'm quite happy to have the Salvation Army coming along saying, look, we believe that we should be closing down pubs and putting up the price of whiskey. Fine, these people genuinely believe it. Get me a Methodist on. Get me some ex-alcoholic, maybe Alistair Campbell or somebody, quite happily. There are people who genuinely hold these positions. I'm not claiming that nobody wants to bring in minimum pricing, obviously not. But let's just have, ordinary consumers battling out, rather than the government tipping the balance by funding all these groups who then go around campaigning and effectively make themselves seem bigger than I think they actually are. And it's not at all obvious to the public generally that these organisations are effectively arms of the state. I've mentioned quite a few. I mentioned quite a few organisations that are 100% funded by the government. How is that an NGO? How is that a non-governmental organisation? Obviously, it's not. The intention is to create a swarm effect, to make it appear that there's lots and lots of these organisations pushing for whatever measure it may be. The point of it is effectively to exclude the public. It's not to broaden the debate. It's not to get more people on side. It's not to empower civil society. It's to create a sort of an artificial civil society that's funded by the state, is likely to do more or less what the state wants it to do, doesn't have much independence, and that thereby creates a closed shop, creates an echo chamber. All these people's write and respond to the public consultations, and the government does whatever it was going to do anyway. It's a farce.